There's new technologies being developed like the Hyperloop, Starlink, the Boring Company, which have the potential to completely transform the way we structure our world. And that's what we're going to be exploring on today's episode of The Living Philosophy. Just before we jump in, if you're enjoying these videos, it'd be really great if you could hit the like button below, and if you're new here, consider subscribing to the channel. All this really helps things to keep growing, so yeah, without further delay, let's jump right in. It's been a trend over the last couple of hundred years towards greater and greater urbanization. This is because all the jobs in industry got concentrated into these big urban centres, and they just needed more and more people. And as the agricultural economy got more and more industrialised, and there was less and less need for those farmhands, more and more people got moved towards the cities. So the cities have been growing, and this has been the trend over the last couple of hundred years, and it's one out of sheer necessity. Now, here in Ireland, there's a big move towards Dublin. Dublin has something like 1/4 of the population of Ireland. And so there's this concentration of jobs there, and Dublin has become a very expensive place to live, and it's famous for that reputation, one of the most expensive cities in Europe. And the rest of Ireland is relatively expensive, but it's nowhere near like Dublin prices. And they've tried to kind of counter this trend with decentralization and stuff, but just because of the way things work, everything has kind of tended to move towards Dublin. And this is a trend that's common around the world as cities have kind of grown, and as industrial centres have kind of gained that centre of gravity which draws more and more in. But I see in the technologies that are being touted at the moment a potential for undermining this. So one really that kind of brings this to mind is the Hyperloop. And this is an idea of traveling through a vacuum tube. So you'd have like a sort of a train that travels through a vacuum tube and it can travel up to 700 kilometers an hour. And so this would get you, so there was talks of Richard Branson doing one from Edinburgh to London, and you could get from Edinburgh to London in 40 minutes. And having been in London, there are parts of London where you can't get from London to London in 40 minutes, like because of traffic, because of congestion. It's very hard to get anywhere. If you're driving or if you're on the bus or whatever, it can be very difficult to cross that distance in that space of time anyway, just from a very short distance. So the idea of getting from Edinburgh to London in 40 minutes, it's, on the face of it, just sounds like, oh, that's great, you can travel faster. But what that could potentially open up if the Hyperloop technology became widely available is that people would no longer have to live in the city. Someone living in Edinburgh could travel to London just as easily as someone living 40 minutes outside London could travel to London. Actually, it would take them a lot less time. And so that opens the potential for, okay, you can work in London, but you don't have to live in London. And that can potentially transform a lot of things if you think on a broad enough scale. So if you think of villages, of towns, and if they're connected into any kind of a hub, if they were somehow connected into this Hyperloop network, then what you could see is people in Ireland anyway they can work in Dublin, but they can commute back to their home place, because the roads in Ireland are notoriously terrible anyway in many parts of the countries. But there's been a trend towards the decay of village life and town life because there's no jobs there and people have to work. But what if people had the option to work in a massive urban centre, but to live somewhere else? Because generally they're tied to either the satellite towns or else to the city itself, and it's very expensive to live in these cities, and it's not necessarily by an ideal, it's quite often it's more by necessity. So what if the Hyperloop was available enough that you would no longer have to live in that major urban centre? Would you still choose to live in that urban centre? And if we mapped that out, you know that a lot of families would choose not to live there. It would be more convenient for them to live where their parents are, so they could have child minding within the family, or maybe they just like to keep contributing. They love their home place, they love the nature around it. And I've met a lot of people in this situation, but who are kind of tied and who have been searching for solutions. So Hyperloop is one way. Now, it would take a lot of technology in order to get there, a lot of infrastructure, but it's the potential to transform the way our cities work, to transform the way our village life works, really to reinvigorate village life around the world. And there's so many villages that are dying around Ireland and have gone extinct, but imagine if the people could continue to live there and to have good jobs, be still connected into the greater world. And Hyperloop isn't the only potential for this kind of technology. With COVID, we've seen a big move towards the idea of working from home, and I know in Ireland there's just been a law passed where a certain percentage, maybe like a third of public sector workers are going to be allowed to work from home permanently. And so what we're seeing is the potential for a working from home as long as we have the internet. So if Starlink manages to bring internet to all rural areas or across the world, then you can constantly be connected into the internet. And if you're allowed to work from home, then you no longer need to be tied to those major urban centers. And so these are all technologies. The Boring Company is another one similar in the camp of Hyperloop, but they're all potential technologies that could completely disrupt the way our cities work. And these concentrations of millions of people in one small place could be disrupted. And I think that there are a few of us that would disagree that would be a great thing. Now, I imagine you still have young people who love to cluster in cities for the bars and nightclubs and the vibrancy of life. But for people who are settling down, having families, for people who prefer a quiet, more solitary life, then I think they will opt more for the villages. There'll be that choice to not have to live in the city. So you can have instead of an either or situation, you can have an and situation. Yes, I can have a good job and I can live in this beautiful remote place. And so that's the potential we could see for a transformation of the world. And I wonder what it would do to property prices, because that's something that's gone constantly up. And for people who have bought places in these major population centres, could that lead to a complete decline in property prices there, while the property prices of the rural areas slowly rise? So it's an interesting thought. It has many implications. We don't really know where it's going to go, but it's something that fascinates me in terms of it allows us to get back closer to nature, back closer to our roots, which is something that industrialization has taken us away from. It's disconnected us from the family unit, from the homestead, from the hearth, from the place where we're coming from. So there's a lot of challenges with it, but I think it could be a great potential for restoring humans to natural sized communities across the world. So really interesting idea, and I just thought I would share that with you today. If you've enjoyed it, please give us a like down below, subscribe if you haven't already, and otherwise I'd love to hear from you in the comments if you have any thoughts, insights or feedback to give me. And otherwise I shall see you next time, guys. Thanks for watching.